Sheba ji, welcome to Chandigarh Lalit Kala Akademi, and we are privileged to have you here. I would like you to talk about your work from two perspectives, as an activist and as the chronicler of what has happened to women's movement in India.
It's a pleasure to be here. I've come back to Chandigarh after a long time and really happy to be here. My practice is quite wide. The question you're asking pertains to a particular period of my practice, but I do also keep circling back and looping around, so it's not a linear, straightforward narrative from one point to the other, but with lots of turns and twists. So I started off as a documentary photographer and an activist, very involved with the women's movement. This is the early 1980s, the height of the anti-dowry movement, where women were just coming out on the street. In a way, we're seeing another such moment in December in Delhi after this terrible gang rape and the outpouring of outrage. There's a huge difference because what we're seeing today is urban, educated, young people, both young men and young women, which is quite different from the 80s. The 80s was really about first establishing that what was being described as kitchen accidents were actually murders. And you would remember how absolutely horrific that period was in terms of women being murdered for dowry, and the collusion of the families, the police, the medical establishment. So what we were doing at that point was basically exposing that collusion, creating public awareness about it in multiple ways, street plays, huge demonstrations, also small demonstrations which ranged from going outside a house where a woman had been killed, doing dharnas there, to major, huge, massive gatherings of women from all walks of life at India Gate, as we see again in December 2012. I was pointing the camera one moment and shouting slogans the next. So I was both activist, very involved in everything, from writing pamphlets, making posters, to photographing. I started photographing to build a sense of our own history. So I was photographing for ourselves. It wasn't for the newspapers. I wasn't a photojournalist. It was also to try and counter the stereotypical representations of women. You either had the beautiful Maharani kind of image, or you had the victim, or you had women advertising various products. I wanted to show women in struggle, ordinary women seeking to change their lives, to change themselves. About 10 years of this work led me to a very strange place, where I'll tell you an incident. I arrived at this demonstration a little early. Everyone was gathering, and I found about 8 to 10 press photographers already there, and they were directing the women to put their hand up, to shout, to create an image which was very similar to the images that I had been making over the years in the heat of the movement, you know, when these expressions naturally arose. So I started photographing the photographers, photographing the women, and I also started thinking about how this image of the militant, struggling woman, which was radical in 1980, had become a stereotype by 1990. So my own work was something that I needed to examine. I had a lot of questions. I had a lot of questions about the so-called truth of documentary. I don't believe any medium is transparent. I believe that every image, every photographic image, is produced from a particular perspective. It is subjective, it takes positions, and it is therefore imbued with a certain kind of politics. The images we receive, especially through the mass media, seem to be objective. because news presents itself as objective. We know that it may not be so. I'm saying this to you. I know that you're a journalist.
It's okay.
But so questions about the nature of documentary, about how documentary feeds into maintaining status quo. Also a question of rights of representation. So I had been making photographs of women who I was very close to. They were sisters in the movement, they were friends, fellow travelers, and I knew them to be far more complex than the images of them. So I entered into a collaborative experiment where I wanted to share the right of representation. So I invited each woman to, in a sense, perform her own portrait. So we worked together. I worked with 8 women, all women I was close to and who I'd photographed over 10 years. And I would ask each woman to choose a place, to choose objects, to choose a posture, a gaze, things that she felt would tell her story. It was a long process, maybe a few months with each woman. And then we would create a kind of theatrical set, a mise en scène, which she felt would somehow express her journey. I also wanted elements of fantasy, of desire, not just the struggle, but other aspects of the person, the creative aspect. It was a really rich and fascinating year-long collaborative project. And I think the images that emerged from that, which I call 7 Lives and a Dream, because I worked with 8 women, only 7 of the portraits are actually have reached a level where I feel good about them and the women feel good about them. The one that failed is the woman I was closest to, my closest friend. So maybe you can be too close.
I have 2 questions for you from this. One is, we have seen women's movement, pass through different phases. After Vishakha's case, there was a lot of involvement of women, and after this Delhi gang rape. How has artists, women artists particularly, how have they contributed to creating mass awareness towards this, apart from, of course, media has played its role? Secondly, do you ever wonder, because you have been a chronicler of women's movement, we don't have any museum of, women's movement in India. I have seen one exceptionally good museum of women in Aarhus, and you wonder what happened to the journey of our women. It's never been properly documented. So what do you think of those 2 things?
I absolutely agree with you. I think this history needs to be told. One of the things I felt very strongly in this recent period, because there's a new formation, there's a new phase and a new stage in the women's movement, and I have such a urgent desire to connect these young women with our history, which is just 15-20 years ago. So even that link has to be made. How does one actually make this link? Because there is no place, there is no archive. There are attempts to create archives, but nothing like a substantial public domain space. So in fact, I am now really trying very hard to find a way to place this work in a public domain so that it becomes part of a larger narrative. But I only, my work pertains to one period. We have the period before that, we have women in the independence struggle. There is research work, so you would find books that actually give a history of the women's movement, making these historical links to pre-independence, independence, and then what's called second wave, which is the 70s and 80s up to the 90s. And now perhaps there'll be a new theorizing of what this wave means and how it's different and how it's connected. But there's an urgent need for a space like this, which would give us our own history and give us also a sense of the complexity of the issues, because while some of the issues, sexual violence, has remained in essence the same issue, But the social context and the economic context is extremely different. So it's through an understanding of history that we can engage with this in a way that is much more meaningful and much more powerful. So as a woman artist who has very strong connections with the movement, I think one way I've tried to contribute is by offering the sense of history. So right now I have a large installation called Record Resist, which is at the Kiran Nadar Museum, which draws on my archive of almost 20 years of chronicling the women's movement to create an installation along with a video which shares my perceptions, my reflections, and the way I now look back at that period from 2012. And it's really curious because this was made in August. It went to the Gwangju Biennale, and it goes, it's like this whole thing explodes and then it's up in the museum at this moment. So we're planning now. The museum is a space, and this is true of most art spaces, that is not still part of a broader public domain. It has to become so. Galleries are ostensibly public spaces, and yet they are only some people who would have the confidence and the class confidence and the confidence of being in the know, being an insider, to go into those spaces. So ordinary people don't come in there. A museum is a space that is more accessible, and I think that's what we need to build and develop, so that these articulations actually come into public discourse. Artists, I think women artists have related to the kinds of issues that have been thrown up from the women's movement in different ways, but the expression of art is usually limited to spaces which are not that public. I have always tried to either take my work out into more public forums. So from the beginning, I have shown my work in, there's a national conference of the women's movement every year. So the first presentation of the staged portraits, which I just spoke about, was at the national conference. Before it went anywhere, it went there. So that has always been for me a space that I take the work to. I've also brought women's groups into cultural spaces. And had organized discussions, whether it was around one of the first installations I did called Wild Mothers, which was at the Max Muller Bhavan in Delhi, and I brought women working in the resettlement colonies, the Sablasangs, who were part of a network of grassroots women's groups, into the installation. We had discussions. I also took them to see other artists' works and tried to make the bridge in both ways. Now I'm planning, along with the curators at the Kiran Nadar Museum, to have a series of discussions and interactions. But one has to work to build these bridges, and it would be a dream come true if we had a women's history museum. It would be fantastic.
It's very much needed. Photography, usually as we understand, is you still a moment. You choose a moment and you still it. But you try to create a narrative out of that still moment. So how do you create that thread, and what are the challenges of this, using this medium, photography, for your narratives?
One of the questions that I grappled with when I made that shift away from classic documentary into the stage portrait was to do with narrative. I questioned this canon, which is a Western modernist canon, of the decisive moment, of this capturing the essence of a person and capturing and shooting. The language also betrays a certain understanding of the relationship between the photographer and the subject. And I really have been seeking a different kind of relationship, a relationship which is to do with finding a place between our subjectivities, between your subjectivity and mine, so that it is not me that is framing you and capturing you, or in that one still frame revealing some essential truth about you. Neither is it you who completely determines how you present yourself, but the conversation between us produces an image which bears the mark of your subjectivity as well as mine. So narrative becomes crucial because we are a highly oral culture, and the way we understand things, particularly difficult things, is by narrativizing them, by telling stories. So people who go through terrible traumas, one form of dealing with it is actually to tell the story. And the story changes as you retell it, and that is a process of healing, it is a process of memory and of being able to live with memory. So one of the things that happens in the stage portraits, for example, is that you'll have 3 images of the same woman in the same set, but each has a very different quality. So you get a different sense of the person, because I believe that we are not singular selves, but we are multiple selves.
That's right.
So this work tries to open a space for that expression. I moved away from working with only the still photograph as a photograph into working with photographs in space. One of my difficulties was that people tend to receive the still image as a kind of bit of information, and especially because we're inundated with the photographic image.
That's true.
Magazines, television, all around us. So people, even in a gallery, when they walk down a wall of photographs, tend to walk quite quickly, like they're flipping the pages of a magazine, cut, 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 you know, and you've sort of got it. I just wanted to slow people down, to make them look, to create a more intimate contact between the photographic image and the viewer. So my movement into installation is actually based on that desire to bring time back into the viewing of photography. So here what I do is actually really alter also the body of the viewer, because things are placed in the round, in space, where the photograph becomes an object in space rather than simply an image. And I then work with layering, I work with objects, with materials, with texts, moving into another kind of language, working with the photograph, but the photograph is no longer the photograph as one conventionally knows it.
In photography, technology is improving every day, and so how does it challenge you? I mean, do you try to take advantage of the latest, what is available in the technology, or I just want to understand how does it work, because the creative part of you must all the time be grappling with, how to deal with this technological interventions.
It goes both ways. So I spoke of layering. So as I grew more and more interested in layering, I started working with light boxes, and initially there were 2 layers, and now there are 4 layers, and they have movement, they have still layers and moving layers. So in a sense this is something that is almost like a pre-cinematic device, rather than something that you would say is part of the lineage of the technology of photography. And I'm in a way going backwards to low-tech experiments with the moving image that were pre-cinema, like magic lanterns. So the light boxes I make are actually very simple technology, but I'm able to achieve what I want in terms of a quality of time, a quality of layering, a kind of gestalt of images fusing together. So that's come out of a desire to create a particular visual experience and finding the technology. In fact, I adapted it from street toys, which I found doing something interesting, and then worked with it and developed it further, and it's become almost like a new medium or a new vocabulary. On the other hand, I am fascinated by technology. I enjoy it. I read science, I read about new developments. I've gotten increasingly interested in virtual, being able to create virtual experiences, so virtual video, and I've worked with that. So I've made a public installation which is about genetically modified foods, which is uses virtual reality, which is the other cutting edge of new technology. But for me, it's never technology for the sake of technology. The desire to say something, to create a particular kind of experience, will lead me to find the appropriate means. I may get excited by something new, like I've just read about a kind of experiment where you can write on water. Now, I'm obsessed with water. A lot of my work is about water, so this is in my brain as something really exciting, but I would only try and learn or access the actual technology and how to do it if it seems absolutely appropriate for a work I'm making.
You just talked of working with water. I would like you to talk about Ganga daughters. I found that work very interesting, and this this myth in our culture that you know, it was a woman. Ganga was a woman. Talk about Ganga river daughters.
Ganga's Daughters is a series that grew out of many years, stretched over about 10-12 years of spending time with, traveling with, being with women ascetics from several streams, from Shaivites to Vaishnavites to Shaktas, mainly in North and Eastern India. I grew fascinated by women who stepped out of the family. These weren't wives, these weren't mothers, they weren't daughters. They were women who were defining themselves in relation to the metaphysical, whatever form that took, whether it is Krishna the lover, whether it is the worship of Shiva, whether it is the worship of Devi, but the definition of self was no longer within family and society, but in a parallel stream. And from the 4th century, we have had that space within our culture. I also encountered these extraordinary poetic texts from the 4th, the 6th, the 12th, the 14th century, written by women mystics. So Akka Mahadevi, Lal Ded, Mirabai, of course, is popularly known, but you have Karaikalammayar. Amazing stories, amazing texts, very contemporary, also in their relationship to the female body and to femininity as such. What does that mean? And the notion of self. So these explorations led me to developing a work which is, again, these photographs are portraits made collaboratively with the women sadhus, and I include with it a video which does something a little different. The portraits and why these women continue to fascinate me was also because of the reinvention of gender. The initiation process, especially if you're a Shaivite, is of performing your own death rites. So you are stripped of hair, clothes, name, all the markers of being female, your family name, your village name, up to 7 pidis, 7 generations ago, and you actually perform the death rites. So you die to who you were, and you are reborn from the Ganga, and you are given the name of one of the rivers. So that's why the title of the work is Ganga's Daughters. Now these women reinvent themselves in a way that is very interesting, because they take on an almost androgynous quality. So when you look at some of these images, you can't be sure whether these are men or women. So they have completely turned this notion of what it means to be female on its head. They have mobility. They move either in pairs or in groups, and often alone, which is very unusual for an Indian woman, even a protected urban upper class woman.
That's true.
You know, so these and the women come from a range of situations. They are women who feel a powerful spiritual call. They are women who just know that this is a place that they can escape to. Often women are fleeing situations of violence as well. Or they're widows, so they've fallen out of the patriarchal structure anyway. They form a kind of sorority, a sisterhood, a way of living where you have some structures which are within the structure of the religious stream that they're part of, the particular akhada or whatever. Most of the women I worked with are from the Juna akhada, which considers itself the most ancient Shaivite akhada. And if you ask any woman her life story, all of them were born under a banyan tree. Because you no longer see yourself as an ordinary person. So you reinvent yourself in the stories of the saints. Every saint was born under a banyan tree, from Guru Nanak to the Buddha. So each woman says that I was born under a banyan tree, and she reinvents herself. She reinvents her story and takes on a performative identity. So in contemporary art practice, especially with a lot of feminist artists, there is a lot of work around performativity, gender and identity, and here you find this rich vernacular stream where this is simply part of the fabric of being a woman sadhu, is a performative identity. So these are some of the many reasons why this group of women has fascinated me, and the work I make. The video, in fact, examines this arena of performativity through two figures. One is through found images of Yogini Amma from the south. I've never met her myself, but somebody I met who heard about my work actually just gifted this set of photographs to me. And they're extraordinary. She's a true mystic, and you can see how she plays with it. At one moment she's absolutely karuna, you know, like the maternal, compassionate love flowing out of her. And the next moment she's fierce. And the next moment she's some kind of figure that has no identifiable gender. So it's about when your social markers become so fluid that they are actually a form of play. And then there's another figure who is a mahant, who is becoming very powerful, because there's politics in the sadhu world as there's politics everywhere. It's a parallel world. They have elections, they have lobbying on election night. And she's emerging as a powerful figure, both as an initiator and a religious figure, and also within the politics of the sadhu world. She is, I've watched her now over 10 years, and she has taken on, she now carries a lathi, she wears a pagdi, she wears a tehmat. Her whole walk and movement has become of a powerful male mahant. And yet she is absolutely female and very strong on the rights of women and the rights of women sadhus. Very interesting to watch her perform these roles and achieve a kind of visibility for women sadhus which has not been there before, because you'll have endless photographs of the Naga sadhus going into the Kumbh, and you'll never see the women. So they have been, in a way, a completely unmapped terrain of female experience, which involves huge numbers of women. These are very large numbers of women who today are actually inhabiting that space.
What are you working now? What's your latest project?
Well, I tend to work in long continuums around something that begins to, in a way, almost obsess me. And the question of water and the question of eco-philosophy have been now my concerns for the last more than 5 years. And I am very concerned about the loss of cultural memory and the need to recover the kind of ecological wisdom that we find embedded in myth and in stories.
Yes.
So a lot of my recent work is about trying to bring that back into the discussion. We speak of the pollution of the Yamuna. We speak of the fact that she is today a drain and not a river. And yet we worship the Yamuna. Every day we sing hymns of praise to her. So the goddess has gotten disconnected from her actual body, which is the river. And I do believe that all our well-meaning discourses about save the river, clean the Yamuna is in distress, don't somehow actually make people change in a profound way, because this disjuncture between the mythic river and the actual river has not been healed. So one of the things I'm trying to do is to work with that, to bring these memories, to bring them into connection again, because perhaps genuine ecologically responsible behavior will arise from a more profound relationship with the issues of the environment, particularly with water and rivers, than simply that of a consumer, where water is a commodity and you don't have enough of it.
Photography is now part of art. I mean, that debate was long back, left behind. Where will it take now as an art form? Because photography is now not only still photography, there are so many different variants to that. How do you look at it now, the futuristic?
I think photography has been completely altered because of mobile phones. So there is a vast dissemination of the capacity of image making in the most widespread democratic fashion, which was unimaginable earlier. Everybody is a photographer. This does something quite amazing to the photographic image. In one way, it becomes very ordinary currency. In another way, it becomes completely unreflected, in the sense
that's true,
that it is that quick capture, it's done, it's over, you may show it to a friend and then it's already over. So what it's doing to memory is very curious. There are these bizarre examples of people from the Syrian struggle, young people who are part of it, who are perhaps even committing a kind of political suicide and are videoing themselves as they're doing it. So is this being actually done, performed for the camera, or is it that you can only inhabit an experience if it's mediated through the camera? There are a number of very serious questions that arise in terms of the relationship between the self and the image. And it's all been completely it's a state of
shaken up
derangement, which is a very rich state. I think something incredible will come out of this. One is that the more careful, conscious, aware use of the image also gets freed from its long baggage of being seen as an indexical document. I mean, photograph will still be evidence in court, but we know now that belief in the photograph as a document of truth is totally destabilized by the widespread use of photography. Everyone knows today, like nobody did before, that photographs are doctored.
Yes.
This simple fact.
Yes.
So it really, in a way, truly makes it an art form. It unmoors it from its historical baggage.
Catching the moment.
Catching the moment, and its invention is as a record. I mean, the first use of photography in India is to document the natives, to build a kind of typology so that they could be ruled better. These are the early uses of photography as a surveillance instrument, and it's absolutely the use now with the identification of everybody, and now the photograph is not enough, so biometrics. So it's a very interesting time with huge changes. I also think that I personally, for example, who was very purist and stayed with the film camera for a long time before I went to a digital camera, I still work with a film camera, except that scanning is so expensive that you turn to a digital camera. I now work very often with creating photographic elements which I then turn into a photo-based image on the computer. So a lot of my work itself has gone in that direction. So would one call this a photographic image? I say photo-based because there will be many elements which are not photographic. And yet its ultimate output as an object may be in the sense of something that is similar to a photographic print. So all these terms are now under question. And I think we will see something very special emerging in terms of the long history of photography and the new meanings that it acquires today. So it's a fantastic moment.
Yes, you know, Art Info has come out with the 100 most memorable works produced in the last 5 years, and you realize that there's not a single canvas, but there are a few photographs. So somewhere, do you think that maybe photography is going to replace canvas art?
I think painting had to reinvent itself because of photography. So what painting did in its early phase, which was attempt a realistic description of landscape, nature, rich people, etc., that whole function and the patronage that lay behind that function disappeared with the advent of photography. So painting was pushed into questioning itself and finding new means. So expressionism, which is still within that arena of seeking to represent what we see, but in a very evolved sense. But you go into various histories of abstraction, you go into high modernism, which is all a movement away from any form of realism or representation, because photography has taken that space. Now photography itself is being destabilized in the arena of representation. So something new will appear, which is also in consonance with the way we as image readers in this historical moment understand image itself.
Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and enriching us with that.
Pleasure talking to you.
Thanks.
Thank you.